Madam Speaker, and it's always a pleasure to rise on behalf of the constituents of Kelowna Lake Country. I rise today to speak on the government's latest attempt at an over-regulating bureaucracy-building legislation, Bill C-49. I've noted in this debate that several speakers on the government side have scarcely spoken much about the details in their own legislation. They've spoken solely on the offshore renewable revenue they believe this bill would potentially offer to applicable provinces. And I say potentially because if the government's members had taken more time to study their own bill in greater detail, they would find that Bill C-49 features such a mess of new red tape. It would be surprising if anyone could complete an offshore project of any kind, let alone have it generate revenue. This is symptomatic of this government's approach to our resource sector. For every talking point, there are miles of new regulations, new levers for federal bureaucracies to kill jobs and projects, and endless delays. Shovel-ready projects that start with Liberal photo ops are left to be strangled by bureaucratic Liberal laws and regulations. After 8 years, this Liberal government has continued to drop the ball on project after project. You would think the government might act with some humility after last Friday when the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that their previous pipeline-killing legislation, Bill C-69, was unconstitutional. Conservatives warned the Liberals repeatedly that their No More Pipelines Act, Bill C-69, did not respect provincial jurisdiction and was a power grab by the Prime Minister and his career activist Environment Minister to phase out these key sectors. Liberals are were called out by energy workers wanting to keep their livelihoods, by Indigenous communities wanting to sustainably develop their lands, by stakeholders in multiple sectors, including wind, hydro, and critical minerals, by 9 out of 10 provincial governments and every territorial government, and now by the Supreme Court of Canada. I could fill speaking here for hours on the comments made by provincial and business leaders on the Supreme Court of Canada ruling against the unconstitutionality of Liberal Bill C-69. But here are just a few. This from the Premier of Alberta. Quote, "The ruling today represents an opportunity for all provinces to stop that bleeding and begin the process of re-attracting those investments and jobs to our economies." And, quote, "We will continue to fight against Ottawa's unfair overreach." Now, the economies of British Columbia and Alberta have been closely intertwined, especially with the resource sector, and many residents in my community of Kelowna Lake Country have worked in the resource sector in Alberta in the past. The Independent Contractors and Business Association of BC president said in an interview on C-69, quote, "Complexity, confusion, and cost, and as a result, investors didn't know if they were going to be investing in Canada and whether or not they could get projects to yes. And that was causing investors to pause and look at other countries rather than Canada." And, quote, "The World Bank came out a few years ago and ranked Canada number 64 in the world in the length of time it takes to approve a project, and that's a very embarrassing statistic for the country." A C.D. Howe Institute report in 2019 titled "A Crisis of Our Own Making, Prospects for Major Natural Resource Projects in Canada" stated, quote, "With investment in Canada's resource sectors already depressed, the federal government's proposed bill would further discourage investment in the sector by congesting the assessment process with wider public policy concerns and exacerbating the political uncertainty facing proponents with a highly subjective standard for approval," unquote. This is exactly what happened. The cost of the Liberals' refusal to reverse course was billions in potential investment that was taken out of Canada. Energy projects that would have been built in Canada were instead built in countries with lower environmental standards and fewer labour protections. This new Bill C-49 should be removed by the government and completely revised because it applies provisions from that now unconstitutional Bill C-69 to Canada's Atlantic offshore sector. Looking at the core details of this legislation, Bill C-49, it is very clear in the needless political roadblocks it seeks to create that will stall projects in our offshore industries. It triples the approvals timeline from the current framework and takes the final authority in the decision-making away from on-the-ground regulators to ministers in Ottawa. This is once again Liberal philosophy of Ottawa knows best. What would be the result of handing the final approval of offshore energy projects to our Greenpeace activist environment minister? The answer is obvious. No good-paying jobs for hardworking Canadians and instead political decision-making. We know this from other legislation like the government's Just Transition Bill, which is seeking to take away jobs from energy workers in the exchange for employment that cannot guarantee the same levels of benefits or pay. Why is this government seeking to hand operational control of the Atlantic offshore industry to a Liberal environment minister that the Newfoundland Liberal member for Avalon said did not understand the, quote, issues of the region? Is a question only the Liberals can answer. Regulators who have worked in this sector and this region for years are better placed to make these decisions on a timeline that already works for both regulators and industry. Adding more red tape, which often does nothing more than repeat pre-existing environmental reviews, will do nothing to create good-paying jobs, particularly in renewables. We know this because of the unmitigated disaster this government made of a viable tidal power project in Nova Scotia. Sustainable Marine Energy's Bay of Fundy tidal energy project had enormous potential to deliver clean energy for Canadians. Had it been built, it could have generated up to 2,500 megawatts, while bringing in $100 million in inward investment and eliminating 17,000 tons of carbon dioxide annually, the equivalent of taking nearly 3,700 cars off the road. The project was proceeding at pace under the Harper government, but after the Liberal government's election, Sustainable Marine Energy was snagged in a forest of red tape from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. After 8 years, that company withdrew the project completely last spring. Despite $28.5 million of taxpayer money having been invested into the project, the government refused to release this clean green project from a regulatory trap of its design. The result, taxpayers are out $28 million, Canada loses out on a powerful source of green energy, and the people of Nova Scotia, who had this environmentally friendly project killed in front of them in Ottawa by bureaucrats, are forced to pay Ottawa's carbon tax now. Bill C-49 will never deliver a dime of renewable revenue to provinces so long as the Liberal government regulates renewable projects like tidal energy out of existence. It will also not deliver revenue from vital offshore drilling projects when the now unconstitutional Bill C-69 enforces impact assessments reviews that last more than 1,600 days, or when Bill C-55 allows the fisheries minister to select prohibited development areas solely on her call, the power which the legislation today also reaffirms. The Prime Minister, in the aftermath of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, said there was no business case for LNG exports to be shipped out through Atlantic Canadian exports to our European allies. And the United States became the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in 2021 as projects ramped up production and delivery surged to Europe to alleviate the energy crisis there. Just last week, one of Canada's closest and historic allies, France, signed a 27-year deal with Qatar for its LNG production. A 27-year deal would have been a fantastic way to generate revenue for Newfoundlanders, Nova Scotians, Albertans, British Columbians, and Canadians. Instead, the Liberal government is clueless of the value of Canada's resources and instead is focused on gaining more political control and its ideological job-killing agenda. And not even a green agenda because, as I mentioned earlier, the government was happy to kill green projects just as slowly. A Conservative government will support Canadians in every region by responsibly building energy projects of every variety that brings home jobs for Canadians. We will build green projects to sustain our environment, not just regulate them out of existence. We will champion Canada's world-class resources to our allies, and we will deliver results. The Liberal government only creates more red tape, regulates projects out of existence, drives away investment, and brings more control to Ottawa. This Liberal government is just not worth the cost.